All right. Hello, everybody. I am so excited to be here today, especially because I am back in my hometown of St. Louis, Missouri. Parkway West 91, baby. All right. Who's out there? Anybody? Parkway West. There it is. So great to be with you. I have such respect for the work that you do around the country, providing support to educators and their learning. You know, there was a time when people just assumed that professional development, as we used to call it, was never going to be fixed, that it didn't do any good and it would never do any good. And you know what? The people in this room came in and you fixed it and you made it better, and you now have found ways to support teachers that is making a difference. In just the last year, such important research coming out, I think it was Professor Matthew Kraft at Brown University, showing that coaching, that the kind of coaching that so many of you in this room do, makes a sizable impact on student achievement. And it's just one other sign that things in our system are going in the right way thanks to the great work you do. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today, is the direction that our system is going in. Let me ask you a question. We heard the NAEP results mentioned before. Raise your hand if you read about the Nation's report card a few weeks ago about the results that came out nationally. And raise your hand if you read about the international test score results that came out last week from PISA. I think the New York Times and that one, the headline was, "It just isn't working. Decades of reform and yet no progress." And tell me if you have heard some of the comments from our Education Secretary, Betsy DeVos, when she has said that what these results show is that there has been no progress over the last couple of decades, all the reform, all the resources, there's been no progress. Does that ring a bell? Let me ask you a question. Does that ring true to you, that there's been no progress? Does that sound right, that somehow all the work that you and your colleagues have been doing, all of the resources and money, all of the political capital that has gone into improving and reforming our schools, that none of that has made a difference? What I'm going to talk about today, what I'm going to try to argue, what I'm going to try to convince you about today is that, in fact, our schools have made progress, our schools are moving in the right direction, that if you get below those very troubling headlines, the story is much more nuanced. And the nuanced story is that were it not for the great work that you're doing out there in our schools, those results would actually be much worse. And that is because we are facing some very difficult headwinds out there in the lives of children and in families that is having a big impact on what's going on in our schools. I also want to argue that if we pay too much attention to this narrative that is forming, that none of this has mattered, that none of this has worked, that we will risk making a mistake that we have made so many times before in education reform. And that is to abandon promising efforts just as they're starting to bear fruit, right? And turn the page and go on to something else. We cannot make that mistake again. So I do want to talk about what explains this lack of progress. I'm not Pollyanna. Let's be honest with ourselves that those headline outcomes are disturbing. On the NAEP, in particular, we see mostly flat lines and in some cases some declines in recent years, especially for our lowest performing kids, who overwhelmingly tend to be our lowest income kids. That should worry us. You know, I'll be clear, I'm a policy guy. I like test scores. I know they don't measure everything that matters, okay? But they do measure skills that do matter for kids' lives. Reading, writing, mathematics, it's not everything. But kids need those basic skills if they're going to have any shot of going on and building those other important skills and going on to post-secondary education, success in career, and to be full participants in our democracy. So these things matter. And I do worry when we see trends that are flat or sloping downwards. I obsess about which states are showing progress and which states are not. By the way, in terms of which states are showing progress, anybody here from Mississippi? All right, yes! Go Mississippi. And D.C., anybody here from D.C.? All right, there we go. A couple of the places that are beating the curve and still getting results. And the story in both places is so much about professional learning and about bringing the science into instruction. So we should be worried about these results, but we need to understand what's happening here. And the argument I want to make is that a lot of what we're seeing is really the devastating impact of the Great Recession. And, sometimes it may feel like that is so far in our rearview mirror, but when we're talking about kids, we know that they grow slowly and that something like living through the Great Recession may be something that's going to stick with them and unfortunately have some pretty negative impacts ongoing. And that may be part of what we're seeing in our results. I also want to say, though, that there are some things that we need to look at soberly from those results and try to figure out whether we need to adjust our strategy in some ways going forward. So we're going to get into some data here. I'm not sure if everybody all the way in the back can see all of this, but let me go through just a few slides and I'll describe them in case you can't see them super well. The main thing I want you to take away from this picture is that progress is possible. What this is showing is fourth grade achievement for African American and Hispanic students on the national assessment at the below basic level. Okay, this is the level that basically indicates basic literacy skills. All right. Now, the horrific news is that way back in the early 90s, you look at these numbers, good grief, that we had 70% of black students were below basic in literacy. 70%, almost as high for Hispanic students. What you see, though, is over the course of the 90s and the 2000s and into the 2010s, amazing, remarkable progress. Okay, dramatic progress that has changed lives, that has changed communities. This means that kids today, African American kids, Hispanic kids, many of our lowest achieving kids, many low-income kids, are now achieving 2 to 3 grade levels ahead of where their peers were in the early 90s. This means that we've got dramatically more young people who are at least meeting those basic standards of literacy and numeracy. This is surely one big part of the reason why we've seen our high school graduation rates go up dramatically. This is changing lives and changing communities. Progress is possible. We have done it, okay? It's even more dramatic when you look at math. This is 8th grade math. Same picture. Dramatic declines in the number of kids who are not reaching those basic standards. This is good. This is what we want to see, okay? But when you go back and you try to understand what might explain this, part of the story is that things got better for kids in families outside of schools, all right? And of course, we've had this debate forever in education about whether poverty matters. Of course poverty matters, right? Of course those social conditions matter. And lo and behold, back in the 90s, things got dramatically better. What this is showing is those top 2 lines again are for African Americans and Hispanics. And what it is showing is that child poverty rates, and this particular one that's called the supplemental poverty rate that includes income, but it also includes government programs, it includes the earned income tax credit, that all of these efforts combine to dramatically drive down those rates in poverty for those groups of kids, okay? And that I think if you put those 2 trends together, what you start to see is that they track one another. That as we drove down the child poverty rates, we also drove down the below basic rates, okay? Now, this context is important because if you start to see at the very end of the story, what we see is that things are starting to go in opposite directions. All right, and the argument here is that these things track each other, but there is a time lag, okay? That the kids that are impacted by something like, the economy getting much better or the economy getting much worse, it surely matters, for kids who are already in school age or middle school or high school, but it seems to matter most for the little kids. It seems to matter most what kind of conditions you were born into, okay? So in the 90s, as these social conditions improved dramatically, it was the kids who were born into those improving conditions, especially lower income kids, who later showed much stronger achievement once they got to school. There was like a 10-year lag for the 4th graders and like a 13-year lag for the 8th graders. Okay, again, that's important to keep in mind. Now, I have to say, all of this is somewhat a hypothesis. We know correlation is not causation. Hard to prove these things, but this sure seems like there is a relationship here. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now, what are we seeing most recently on the National Assessment of Educational Progress? This particular chart is looking at 8th grade reading by the different percentile levels. What you see is that over the last 10 years, things have been mostly flat. But the really concerning thing that we're seeing is at the bottom, the 10th percentile, the 25th percentile. Those students in the last few times of taking the test are suddenly doing much worse. And it's alarming. These 8th grade scores are down, going down basically 10 points since their high. That is a whole grade level. So some of that progress that we made back in the 90s and 2000s, we've now given back over the last 10 years. That should get our attention, and that is worrying. The question is, what is driving that? And again, my argument is that it is largely the Great Recession. Now, I'm almost sure that those of you in the back can't see this chart, but basically what it is showing is the different slices of cohorts of kids, okay? The different kids, when they took the different tests, the 4th grade NAEP, the 8th grade NAEP, and backing up, when were they born? When were they in preschool? When were they kindergartners? What you see is a clear pattern, if you can see it, is a clear pattern where the kids, where you start to see things going south, is for kids who were born into the Great Recession, who were young during those very difficult years. I mean, remember, back in 2011, 12, 13, unemployment rate over 9%. I mean, we call it the Great Recession because it was not just a regular economic downturn. It was a calamity. And for low-income families in particular, it was an incredible hardship. And you can imagine, as hard as things always are for kids growing up in poverty, at that time, things were surely especially stressful. And the 8th graders that took that test, again, where we saw this huge decline, especially at the bottom, those kids were toddlers and preschoolers when the Great Recession hit, okay? And then they grow up and they go into school in kindergarten, 1st grade, and that's when the big spending cuts happened, right? Back in 2012, 2013, 2014. The first time in American history that we actually year over year cut education spending in real dollars. And of course, in some places, it was cut by a lot, right? And so these kids faced the double whammy of being born into this tough situation and then going to school in those very critical years, kindergarten, 1st, 2nd grade, when schools were really struggling the most. So that is one part of the story, I believe, is that what we are seeing is that kids who really got off to a very challenging start and now are making their way through schools. Now, one thing this means is that these kids, as they go on, are going to need even more support than ever, right? And we've got to do what we can to help them. The other thing it means, though, is that the kids that follow them, who have grown up in much better conditions once the Great Recession ended, now that spending has come back, the hope is they will start to do better. Okay, so when you hear Betsy DeVos say, that these trends prove that our schools aren't getting any better, the response is, hold on, let's talk about the context, right? Back in the 90s and 2000s, we had the wind at our back. Social conditions for poor kids were getting better. More recently, we've had real headwinds as conditions got worse. Now they're starting to turn around again. All right, so let's see. Let's go back. Okay. Now, some other people have been throwing other ideas out there as well. And the thing about these test scores, as much as we all love data, and at your local level, you can dig into data and really start to draw some conclusions. At the national level, it's hard. We look at these data and we have to make our best guesses. Okay, but many people have been saying, well, what about screens? Is that another possibility? Certainly, those of us with kids, who've got little kids at home? Anybody? Yes. Anybody have teenagers at home? Yes. Anybody teach teenagers or little kids? I mean, we know the phones are everywhere. And there is this concern that the phones could be having an impact on our kids' ability to learn, and especially the phones, that all the screen time and the phone use is happening at home. What this chart shows is that, in fact, in recent years, we've seen this very disturbing uptick in screen time for the lowest income kids. Somewhat for other kids, but not nearly as much. Now, it's always been the case that lower income kids tend to be on screens more, and you can understand it's tough if you're a single parent and you're working 2 jobs, and sometimes the only option is for your child to be watching PBS. That's probably a better option than other things. But what we see in this chart, at least, is that maybe things have gotten even worse, and that's something we should be very worried about, okay? But there's one more possibility, and it is the thing that we all have the most control over, and it's the big shift that has happened in our schools. That not so long ago, we were focused, under the No Child Left Behind years, on fairly low standards. And now, under the regime associated with Every Student Succeeds Act, we are aiming for a much higher bar, okay? the reason is, as much as we were excited that we were making progress and getting more kids to those basic levels of literacy and numeracy I talked about a few minutes ago, we knew that wasn't enough. That it was better than not getting to those standards, but if you actually wanted to be prepared for college and career, we needed to aim a lot higher. And we would look at charts like this. What this is showing is that the top number is the percentage of kids who are going to post-secondary education right away out of high school. It's near 70%. Kids are getting the message to go to college, and they're going. The problem is only about 40% of them are actually ready for college, okay, in basic skills of reading and math and writing. And guess what? How many finish college? About 40%. So we knew if we want to get that number up, we have got to dramatically raise our standards. And that is what we did, right? 2010, the Common Core comes in. 2015, you've got PARCC and Smarter Balanced, and now another set of tests after that. And 2018, under ESSA, new accountability systems. But notice, we have not been doing this for very long, right? This has taken us the better course of this decade to shift the whole system towards aiming towards these higher standards. And most importantly, the work around curriculum and helping teachers teach with those new curriculum. That work is almost entirely brand new, because back in 2010, of course, the Common Core line curricula didn't exist. It took many years for them to get built. And it is only in the last few years that we now have, according to education reports, a strong set of Common Core line curricula for teachers to use in the classroom. Now the work is happening, the work that you do to help teachers understand how to use those curricula and how to help kids reach these much higher standards, okay? So that is the work, implementing the curriculum, implementing the effective professional learning. But let me finish with this one last thought that we really need to mull over, and I hope maybe in the conversation later we can discuss. If you go back and you look at those trends and you say, it looks like things are relatively flat for most kids. It's actually at the very high end, we're seeing a little bit of progress for our highest achieving kids. But things are really falling behind for the low achievers. Now, I think that is largely because of the Great Recession, but it could also be that our schools over the last 10 years have been shifting their focus. Under No Child Left Behind, the entire focus was on getting the lowest performing kids to a very low standard. And we made progress against that goal, okay? Then we have shifted now to a different goal, which is let's get many more kids to a much higher standard. And what's interesting is it appears that we may be doing a better job with some of our higher achieving kids getting to those higher standards under the Common Core and the other state standards, right? But are we leaving some of the lowest performers behind? When I'm sure you hear this all the time in your schools and districts, I hear it all the time everywhere, that educators are really wrestling right now with the work of how do I help kids who are below grade level, who may be 3 years below grade level, catch up and get to do that grade level work. I know Dr. Santolisa talked about this yesterday. That is the great challenge of our time. We want to get many more kids to these high standards, but we can't leave the low performers behind. We certainly don't want to go back to the No Child Left Behind days, right, where we say, well, let's just lower the standard and let's just focus on just getting kids over a very low bar. But we cannot go back to the era of leaving those children behind either. Thank you very much.